The old pickup truck's engine protested with a low rumble as Ethan Riley turned off the main coastal highway. The crunch of gravel under the tires was the only sound that pierced the persistent rush of the wind and the distant rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean. For the last 2 hours, the road had twisted along the Oregon coastline, a winding gray ribbon between dense dark forest and an endless churning sea. He was tired, a weariness that went bone deep, a fatigue of the soul that had been his constant companion for 3 years. Ethan Riley stepped out of the truck cab, his old brown leather jacket groaning in protest against the damp air. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and lean, with a frame that suggested a strength now weathered by time and hardship. His face was rugged, carved with the lines of too much sun and too many sleepless nights, but his eyes, when they met yours, held a deep, quiet kindness. His brown hair, overly long, was streaked with silver at the temples, matching the thick, scruffy beard that covered his jaw. From the passenger side, a second figure emerged, landing on the gravel with a soft thud. Gage followed his master, a large German shepherd whose magnificent coat was a striking mix of silver gray and white. He was perhaps 6 years old, in the prime of his life, and he moved with the quiet confidence of a trained service animal. His intelligent eyes immediately scanned the perimeter, a brief professional assessment, before he came to stand silently by Ethan's leg. A newer sedan was already parked near the house. A man in a sharp suit, looking profoundly out of place against the wild backdrop, stepped out. He was Mr. Vance, the realtor, a man whose practiced smile seemed to be fighting a losing battle with the cold sea spray. "Mr. Riley," Vance said, extending a hand, "you made good time. She's quite the spot." Ethan simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the house. It stood on a bluff of volcanic rock, isolated, seeming to brace itself against the wind. It was a 2-story wooden structure, its original color long since scoured away by salt and rain to a dull silvered gray, like driftwood. It looked historic, forgotten, and profoundly lonely. It was exactly what Ethan wanted. "Let's get the formalities done, shall we?" Vance said, shuffling papers on a clipboard. He seemed eager to conclude the business and get back to civilization. They stood on the sagging front porch. The wind whistled through the eaves. Vance cleared his throat, adopting the formal tone he had used on the phone. "Now, as we discussed and as you've signed," he began, "this is a cash only, as a sale. The significantly reduced price, as you know, reflects these terms." "I understand," Ethan said. His voice was gravelly, unused. Good. Vance was visibly nervous. "It's just, I have to reiterate the primary condition from the estate of the late Eleanor Vance." He paused, taking a breath. "The basement is sealed per the explicit, legally, binding instructions of her last will and testament. It must remain so permanently." Vance looked up from his clipboard, making eye contact. "By purchasing this property, you, the new owner, accept any and all structural liability for that part of the house unseen. You waive all rights to inspection or complaint regarding the foundation or anything below the first floor." He waited, as if expecting Ethan to argue, to show even a flicker of curiosity. Ethan just looked at the weathered front door. He had spent the last of his savings, the money from the sale of his and Amy's home back in Montana, on this place, a place he had only seen in grainy online photos. He was running from a life that had become too loud, filled with the echoes of memories he could not face. He was not looking for a project, for a mystery. He was looking for an ending. "I just need a place to be, Mr. Vance," Ethan said quietly, his gaze drifting to the gray horizon. "I don't plan on doing any entertaining. The basement stays sealed. It's not a problem." Relief washed over the realtor's face. "Excellent. Then she is all yours." He handed over a single old-fashioned brass key. Ethan took it. The metal was cold. Vance shook his hand quickly, mumbled something about dropping the final paperwork by mail, and was in his car and speeding down the gravel drive before Ethan had even turned the key in the lock. The lock was stiff. It took a hard turn of Ethan's wrist, and the mechanism finally gave way with a loud click. Ethan pushed the door open. Gage, ever vigilant, pressed slightly ahead, his nose testing the air. The outside of the house was weathered, beaten by the elements. The inside was something else entirely. It was as if Ethan had stepped not just into a house, but into a different year. The air was still, heavy, and smelled not of rot or mildew, but of old fabric, lemon oil, and something faintly floral. It was pristine. A thick mustard-yellow shag carpet covered the living room floor, perfectly clean. A long sofa with a bold turquoise and brown floral pattern sat against the far wall, its wooden trim gleaming. It was a time capsule. "Well, Gage," Ethan murmured, stepping fully inside. The door closed behind him, muffling the sound of the wind. The silence of the house was immediate and absolute. Gage sneezed at the strange old smell, then walked forward, his claws making a soft ticking noise on the linoleum as he passed from the carpet into the adjoining kitchen. Ethan followed, his boots feeling alien and heavy on the immaculate carpet. The kitchen was a museum of 1960s optimism, pale pink countertops, a seafoam green refrigerator that hummed gently, and a harvest gold rotary phone hanging on the wall. There was not a speck of dust on the Formica dining table. It was as if Mrs. Eleanor Vance had simply vanished one afternoon in 1965 and time had stopped. This perfect, eerie stillness was precisely what Ethan craved. It was the opposite of the chaos in his own mind. It was a place where nothing had happened for a very, very long time. He walked down a short carpeted hallway, past a small bathroom and a linen closet. At the very end of the hall was another door. This one was different from the others. It was a plain, windowless wooden door, painted the same cream color as the walls, but it was not meant to be opened. A thick, heavy-duty steel hasp was bolted into the door and the door frame, and a large, rusty padlock secured it. It was not just locked, it was fortified. Ethan stared at it. This was the door, the forbidden entrance. Gage padded up beside him and sniffed at the base of the door. He didn't whine or growl, he just sniffed, tilted his head, and then looked up at Ethan as if to say, "This is part of the house, I suppose." Ethan reached down and scrubbed the thick fur on Gage's neck. He felt no curiosity, only a dull acknowledgement. It was another man's secret, another woman's past. It had nothing to do with him. He turned his back on the sealed door. "Come on, boy," Ethan said, his voice echoing slightly in the silent house. "Let's get the bags. We're home." The first few days at the house were defined by a profound and cleansing silence. Ethan had sought a vacuum, and he had found one. The only sounds were the ones he chose, the hiss of the gas stove as he heated coffee, the classical music he played from a small portable radio, and the constant distant sigh of the Pacific Ocean. He and Gage fell into a simple, disciplined routine. They rose before the sun, when the sky over the sea was a cold, bruised purple. They would walk for miles along the deserted beach below the cliffs, Gage racing ahead into the surf and returning to shake a spray of icy water onto Ethan, who would accept the gesture with a rare, quiet smile. Ethan was methodical in making the house his own, but he did so with a light touch, as if he were a guest. He unpacked his few boxes, books, clothes, kitchen essentials, and a single-frame photo of his late wife Amy, which he placed on the nightstand. He spent an afternoon repairing a loose shingle on the porch roof, and another clearing the overgrown path to the cliff edge. The house accepted his presence. Its stillness felt like a balm. But the house, he learned, was not entirely still. Gage was the first to notice. As a service animal trained to detect the subtle shifts in Ethan's own body chemistry, the spike in cortisol, the change in breathing that preceded a PTSD episode, Gage was a creature of profound sensitivity. He was attuned to the world in ways Ethan was not. On the third night, Ethan was in the living room reading a book under the light of a single lamp. The 1960s-era turquoise and brown sofa was surprisingly comfortable. Gage, who usually lay at his feet, was not present. "Gage?" Ethan called out, his voice sounding loud in the quiet. There was no answering jingle of tags. He got up and walked into the short, carpeted hallway. He found Gage standing rigid, a few feet from the padlocked basement door. His entire body was tense, his head low, his ears pinned back. A low, continuous whine was vibrating deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ethan said softly, walking toward him. Gage didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the bottom of the door. As Ethan got closer, the dog's whine deepened into a soft, guttural growl. It was not a sound of aggression, but of deep, profound anxiety. Ethan crouched, resting his hand on the dog's tense shoulders. "It's just an old house, Gage. Probably just mice in the walls, or a draft." He put his hand against the door. It was cold, but no colder than the rest of the house. He could smell nothing but old paint and the faint, dusty scent of the hallway. He pushed on the door. It was as solid as the wall itself. "See? Nothing. Let's go." Gage refused to move. He was shivering slightly. This was the behavior that worried Ethan. Gage was a working dog, trained in stressful environments. He was not a skittish animal. This was uncharacteristic. "Come," Ethan said, using a firmer command tone. Gage obeyed, but with visible reluctance. He tore his gaze from the door and followed Ethan back to the living room, but he did not settle. He sat by the entrance to the hall, staring into the darkness, a silent, worried sentinel. The next day, Ethan set about addressing a more practical problem. The lights in the kitchen and hallway flickered constantly, and the breaker box in the pantry was an ancient fused block model from at least 1960. Several of the outlets in the house were two-pronged and ungrounded. It was a fire hazard. "All right, boy," he said to Gage, who was once again at his post near the basement door. "I'm going into town. Need to update this place before it burns down around us. You stay. Watch the house." Gage whined in response, clearly unhappy about being left alone with the door. Ethan grabbed his leather jacket and headed out. The gravel drive felt longer on the way out. He followed the winding road back toward the highway, and then south toward the cluster of buildings that passed for Seacliff Harbor. The town was just a handful of streets huddled around a working fishing port. The air smelled of low tide, diesel, and frying fish from a small cafe. It was not a tourist town. The buildings were functional, their paint peeling from decades of salt spray. He saw a post office, a tavern, and one single-story building with a faded sign that read Seacliff Harbor General and Hardware. A small bell attached by a string announced his entry with a cheerful jingle. The store was a relic, a dim, cavernous space that smelled of sawdust, iron, and fertilizer. Every possible inch of wall and floor space was occupied. It sold everything from fishing tackle and motor oil to plumbing supplies and canned goods. Behind a massive wooden counter at the back stood the owner, an old man in a red flannel shirt and wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was reading a newspaper and didn't look up immediately. "Help you with something?" he asked, his eyes still on the page. "Looking for some electrical," Ethan said. "New breakers, grounded outlets, some wiring." The man finally lowered his paper and looked at Ethan. His eyes were sharp, assessing the new face instantly. In a town this small, a stranger was an event. "Aisle 4 on the left," the owner said, nodding. "But the breakers are behind the counter. What kind you need?" Ethan described the old fused box. The owner nodded slowly. "Ah, sounds like you're in one of the old places. Big job?" "Just need to make it safe," Ethan said, heading to the aisle. He returned a few minutes later with a basket full of supplies. As he set them on the counter, the owner began tallying the items. "Don't recognize you. Just moving in, something like that?" "Something like that," Ethan said, hoping to keep the conversation short. "Well, welcome to Seacliff Harbor. Not many folks move to here," the man chuckled. "Need this delivered?" "No, I can take it. It's for the house on the bluff." The owner's hand stopped moving. He looked up, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to genuine, undisguised surprise. "The bluff? You don't mean you bought the Vance place?" Ethan just nodded, pulling his wallet from his jeans. "Well, I'll be," the old man said, leaning on the counter and momentarily forgetting the sale. "Been empty a good while, ever since old Mrs. Vance passed. We all wondered who'd be brave enough to take it on." Ethan stayed silent, counting out the cash. The owner couldn't help himself. The need for town gossip was too strong. "She was a strange one, Mrs. Eleanor was," he said, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Lived up there all alone. My goodness, must have been 50 years. Didn't come into town lest she absolutely had to. My father used to deliver her groceries once a month, just leave them on the porch. She'd leave the money in an envelope." He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Folks around here always had theories, you know. Lots of them." He bagged the last outlet. "Some folks say she was hiding a fortune up there. Old family money from the Vance clan that practically founded this town. Others," he leaned in a little closer, "others just said she was plain crazy, batty as they come." He pushed the bag toward Ethan. "Anyway, good luck with the place. She's got history, that one." "Thanks," Ethan said, picking up the heavy bag. He walked out of the store, the bell jingling his exit. He drove back through the small town, the owner's words echoing in his head. Hiding a fortune, plain crazy. He arrived back at the house. It looked the same as before, gray, isolated, silent. But the old man's words had changed it. It was no longer just an empty house. It was the house of Eleanor Vance, the strange one. He walked inside, the heavy bag in his hand. The house was quiet. Then he heard it, from the end of the hall, a long, low, miserable whine. Gage was back at his post, staring at the padlocked door, and this time, Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. For 2 weeks, the routine held. Ethan worked on the house, and Gage kept his anxious vigil. The coastal weather had been polite, offering gray skies and a persistent misty drizzle. But Ethan, having spent time at Fort Lewis in Washington state, knew the Pacific Northwest. He knew that this politeness was a temporary truce. On a Tuesday afternoon, the truce broke. The first sign was the change in the wind. It no longer sighed. It began to shriek, a high-pitched, thin sound that came from the northeast. The sky, usually a pale, washed-out gray, turned the color of a fresh bruise, a heavy yellowish purple. Ethan stood on the back porch, the wind whipping his long hair across his face. He watched the ocean. The waves, usually rhythmic and distant, had become chaotic and violent. Great mountains of gray water crashing against the base of the cliff, sending plumes of spray halfway up the rock face. "Gonna be a bad one, Gage," he said, stepping back inside and sliding the glass door shut. Gage was not by the door. He was already pacing the short hallway, his nails clicking on the linoleum in the kitchen as he made a short, anxious loop. His agitation had nothing to do with the weather. The storm outside only seemed to amplify his fixation on the padlocked door. By nightfall, the house was under siege. The rain came in horizontal sheets, lashing against the windows with the force of thrown gravel. The entire structure, built in a different era, groaned under the pressure. It was a symphony of old wood, the house creaking and settling and whistling as the wind found every tiny crack. Ethan made a simple dinner of canned soup, but the power flickered twice, then died completely, plunging the house into a profound, howling darkness. He lit a kerosene lamp, its warm yellow glow casting huge, dancing shadows on the mustard-yellow walls. He felt the old tension setting in. The isolation he had craved was now absolute. There was no radio, no phone, no distant headlights. There was only the storm, the house, and the dog. He went to bed early, hoping to sleep through the worst of it. He lay in the darkness of the master bedroom, the kerosene lamp turned down low on the dresser. Gage, instead of lying on his usual mat at the foot of the bed, was standing, trembling, his body rigid as he stared at the bedroom door, listening. The wind was a constant deafening roar, but it was the other sounds that were getting to him. The pressurized groaning of the walls, the sharp, heavy rattle of the window panes, and then a new sound. It was a deep, concussive thump. A sudden, violent pocket of air pressure struck the side of the house like a giant, open-handed slap. The whole building shuddered. Ethan was no longer in Oregon. The pressurized thump was not the wind. It was the air itself compressing, the sound just before the shrapnel. The high-pitched whistle in the eaves was not the storm. It was the incoming round, the terrifying personal shriek of a mortar. He was flat on his back, but not on a mattress. He was on hard-packed sand, the smell of cordite and diesel fuel filling his nostrils. The air was not cold and wet. It was hot and choking, thick with pulverized dust. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He heard shouting, but it was distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." The words repeated in his head, but he couldn't form them. He was frozen, a prisoner of a memory that felt more real than the bed he was lying in. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Another heavy gust slammed the house, and he flinched violently, a choke sound escaping his throat. Suddenly, a heavy weight landed on his chest. It was not debris. It was solid, and it was warm. A second later, something cold and wet pressed urgently against his hand, which was clenched by his side. Ethan gasped, a painful tearing intake of air. His eyes, wide and unfocused, slowly found the shape in the darkness. Gage. The dog had leaped onto the bed and was now lying lengthwise on top of him, his 100-pound frame a living anchor, a technique called deep pressure therapy. The dog pushed his wet nose under Ethan's hand again, nudging it, whining softly. The smell of cordite faded. Ethan smelled dog fur and the damp sea air of the bedroom. The shouting in his memory was replaced by the low, concerned whine of his companion. He was in Oregon. He was in a house. The sound was the wind. "Good boy," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. His hand, still shaking, came up to grip the thick gray fur of Gage's neck. "Good boy, Gage. I'm here. I'm here." He lay there for a long time, listening to his own heart slow down, focusing on the simple, vital reality of the dog's breathing. Gage did not move, his chin resting on Ethan's shoulder, until the shivering finally stopped. The storm raged on, but the terror had passed. Ethan was exhausted, but he was present. He was just beginning to drift into a shaky, shallow sleep when the new sound came. It was completely different from the wind. In a momentary lull between gusts, a sharp splintering crack echoed from deep inside the house. It was not the sound of wood bending, it was the sound of wood breaking. This was followed by a heavy, wet structural collapse, a sound of things falling into water, and then the worst sound of all, the unmistakable, terrifying noise of water not just dripping, but gushing. It was pouring unimpeded somewhere below his feet. "What now?" Ethan said, sitting up too quickly. Gage was instantly off the bed. He ran into the hallway, not in fear, but in alarm. He stopped at the padlocked basement door. Ethan grabbed the heavy flashlight from his nightstand and followed. The beam cut through the darkness. Gage was standing a few feet back from the door, his fur on end. He was letting out a low, desperate growl. A wave of cold subterranean air hit Ethan in the face. With it came an aggressive, gut-turning stench. It was the concentrated smell of decades of mildew, of earth, and of raw, stagnant sewage. He aimed the flashlight beam at the bottom of the door. A thick, dark, filthy water was pouring from the gap under the door, spreading rapidly over the linoleum, already soaking the edges of the mustard-yellow carpet. Ethan stared at the rusty padlock. He thought of the realtor. He thought of his promise. The sound of rushing water grew louder, a steady, destructive torrent. The house was flooding from below. The promise was broken. The filthy water was already spreading into the living room, staining the edges of the shag carpet a sickening dark brown. Ethan stared at the rusty padlock, his mind racing. That seal, that promise. It meant nothing if the house collapsed into the sea. Eleanor Vance's weakness, whatever it was now irrelevant. The immediate violent threat was the water. He knew from his training that a compromised foundation, especially on a cliff, was a death sentence for a building. The gushing sound from below was not a leak. It was an amputation. "Okay," he said, his voice a low growl. "We're going in." He turned from the hallway and ran to the front door, yanking it open. The storm met him with a physical blow, a wall of wind and horizontal rain that stole his breath. He sprinted, head down, through the ankle-deep mud of the yard to his truck, the wind screaming in his ears. He fumbled with the clasp on his heavy-duty toolbox, his fingers already numb. He grabbed the long red handles of his bolt cutters and ran back to the house, slamming the door against the storm. He was dripping, muddy, and energized by a tactical purpose. He returned to the hallway. Gage was waiting, standing just back from the spreading pool of water, his silver and white fur bristling. The dog watched him with an intense, intelligent focus. Ethan jammed the hardened steel jaws of the cutters around the thick shackle of the padlock. The metal was old and pitted with rust. He put his shoulder into it, clenching his jaw and squeezing the handles together. For a second, there was only resistance. Then, with a sharp metallic snap that echoed in the small hallway, the shackle gave way. He ripped the broken lock and the hasp from the door frame and threw them onto the carpet. He grabbed the simple brass knob, turned it, and pulled. The door was stuck, its bottom edge swollen shut by the water. He braced his foot against the wall and yanked. The old wood groaned in protest before tearing free with a wet sucking sound. A wave of subterranean air, a concentrated physical stench of mildew, damp earth, and raw sewage, blasted him in the face. It was suffocating. Ethan aimed his heavy flashlight into the black square. The beam hit a set of narrow, rickety-looking wooden stairs that descended into churning black water. The noise was deafening. It was not just a leak, it was a pressurized torrent. He took the first step, his boot landing with a splash in the cold water that already covered the bottom stair. Gage whined, a high, sharp sound of protest, but followed, his own paws tentatively testing the water. Ethan descended slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the absolute darkness. The basement was larger than he'd expected, but it was a nightmare. The ceiling was low, webbed with cobwebs thick as cotton. The water below was opaque, swirling with debris, perhaps boxes or old furniture. Then he saw the source. To his left, near the base of the stairs, was the main utility entrance. A thick, corroded iron pipe, which he assumed was the main water line, had burst. It was not a seam leak. A jagged crack a foot long was gaping in its side. It was shooting a thick, powerful stream of water horizontally across the basement, hitting the far foundation wall with industrial force. The sound was a constant, deafening roar. He was a veteran. He understood triage. First, stop the bleed. "The shut-off!" he yelled to himself over the noise. "Gotta be a shut-off!" He stepped off the last stair. The water was shockingly cold, a thermal blow that made him gasp. It was deeper than he thought, surging just below his knees. It was filthy, and he could feel the slick, unseen mud of the floor under his boots. He began to wade forward, holding the flashlight high. The main shut-off valve had to be here somewhere, near where the pipe entered the house. He pushed through the frigid water, his jeans instantly soaked. Debris slick with slime bumped against his legs. Come on," he muttered, scanning the concrete walls, his eyes stinging from the putrid air. The force of the spray was already undermining the far wall, washing away the mortar between the foundation stones. Eleanor's weakness wasn't in the foundation. It was this ancient, neglected plumbing, a time bomb waiting to go off. He was so focused on the wall, so consumed by the noise and the cold, that he didn't immediately notice he was alone. He'd been waiting for almost a minute, his frustration rising when he realized he no longer felt Gage bumping against his leg. "Gage!" he yelled, swinging the flashlight beam around. He expected to see the dog waiting nervously on the stairs, terrified of the deep, swirling water. Gage was not on the stairs. The flashlight beam found him. The dog was across the basement, a good 30 feet away in the farthest, darkest corner. He was standing on a section of floor that seemed to be slightly higher, the water there only a shallow pool around his paws. He was completely ignoring the chaos of the burst pipe. His body was rigid, his nose pressed against the flat, seemingly solid concrete of the back wall. "Gage, get back here! It's not safe!" Ethan shouted. Gage ignored him. He was locked in. Ethan watched as the dog took a small step back, then pushed his nose against the wall again, sniffing with short, intense huffs. Ethan turned back to the pipe. He had to find the valve. This was a distraction. But then he heard it. It was a sound so quiet it barely registered against the roar of the water. It was a soft scrape. 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 He swung the light back to Gage. The dog was pawing at the wall, not a frantic, fearful scratch, but a methodical, intentional one. He would scrape at one spot, then whine, then nudge the concrete with his nose. "Gage, what are you doing?" Gage stopped, looked over his shoulder at Ethan, and let out a single, low, urgent woof. It was not a bark. It was a summons. Ethan sighed, his breath fogging in the cold, damp air. He was soaked, freezing, and his house was actively destroying itself. But he knew that sound. It was the same sound Gage had made in training when he had located a target. It was the "I have found it" alert. He trusted this dog with his life. He had on more than one occasion. "All right," Ethan growled, his frustration warring with his training. "All right, I'm coming." He began the long, difficult wade across the basement, pushing against the current created by the burst pipe. The water was deeper in the middle. He stumbled on something submerged, an old chair maybe, and nearly went under. He cursed under his breath, regaining his balance, and pushed forward, the beam of his flashlight locked on the gray and white dog. He finally reached the far corner. As the floor suggested, the concrete here was elevated by several inches, a dryish island in the middle of the flood. Gage was standing there, vibrating with a contained, focused energy. "What, boy? What is it?" Ethan said, his teeth chattering. He shone the light directly on the wall. It looked like all the other walls. It was gray, damp concrete, stained with age. Gage nudged his hand, then pushed his nose against the wall again, letting out a low, insistent rumble. Ethan put his free hand on the wall. It was cold and solid. He knocked on it with his knuckle. The sound was a dull, solid thud. "It's just a wall, Gage. It's concrete." Gage pawed at it again, scraping his claws against the stone, and looked at Ethan with an intensity that said, "You are wrong." Ethan frowned. He moved the flashlight beam closer. The wall was concrete, yes, but here in this corner, he squinted. The texture was different. The rest of the basement was poured concrete forms, but this section, it looked like it was made of cinder blocks covered over with a thick, crude layer of plaster or mortar, applied by hand in a desperate, sloppy attempt to make it look like the rest of the wall. It was different. Gage, seeing his master finally paying attention, let out another low, urgent woof. Ethan stared at the wall, the roar of the gushing water fading into the background, replaced by a new, sudden, and profound curiosity. The roar of the burst pipe was a physical force, a pressurized, chaotic noise that filled the small space and rattled Ethan's nerves. He stood in the freezing, knee-deep water, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating two contradictory problems: the immediate, catastrophic flood and the quiet, stubborn insistence of his dog. Gage was still pawing at the strangely plastered wall, letting out a low, frustrated growl. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline, the cold forgotten. His military training screamed at him, "Triage! Stop the bleeding!" The wall was a mystery for later. The water was a threat for now. "Gage, stay!" he commanded, his voice sharp over the din. He turned his back on the dog and waded back into the deeper, swirling water. He pushed past the submerged debris, his flashlight beam scanning the concrete wall near the base of the stairs. He had missed it in his first frantic search. There, tucked behind another set of corroded pipes, was a large, red-painted wheel valve. It was caked in rust and slime. He jammed his flashlight into the pocket of his leather jacket, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling, and grabbed the wheel with both numb hands. He pulled. It didn't budge. It felt like it was welded to the pipe. "Come on," he hissed, planting his boots firmly in the unseen mud. He repositioned his grip and threw his entire weight against it, using his legs, his back, every ounce of strength. For a heart-stopping second, there was only the screech of the rushing water. Then, with a groan of metal-on-metal protest, the wheel screeched and turned. It was impossibly stiff. He fought it for a full minute, his muscles burning in the cold, turning it inch by painful inch. The pressurized roar began to change. The violent horizontal spray faltered. The sound dropped from a roar to a gurgle, then a heavy choking cough, and finally, silence. The sudden absence of noise was staggering. The only sounds left were the steady, hard drumming of the storm lashing the house above, the soft, constant dripping of water from the ceiling, and one other sound: scrape, scrape, whine. In the new, tomb-like quiet of the basement, Gage's activity was suddenly, shockingly loud. Ethan pulled his flashlight from his pocket. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, his hands raw from the rusted wheel. But now the mystery was the only thing left. He waded back across the basement. The water was no longer swirling. It was a still, black pool. He reached the raised corner where Gage was waiting. The dog looked up at him, then immediately back at the wall, more insistent than ever. "Okay," Ethan said, his breath pluming in the flashlight beam. "You've got my attention." He confirmed his earlier suspicion. This patch of wall, roughly 8 feet wide, was different. The plaster was sloppy, uneven, as if applied by an amateur in a frantic hurry. It didn't match the smooth, poured concrete forms of the rest of the foundation. Ethan trusted his dog. He trusted his own eyes. This was a cover-up. He turned and waded back through the frigid water, his legs feeling like lead. He ascended the rickety stairs, his boots squelching. He ran through the hallway, tracking filthy water over the linoleum, and burst back out the front door into the screaming wind and rain. He grabbed the 10-pound sledgehammer from his truck bed. When he returned to the basement, Gage was in the exact same spot, a gray and white statue of pure focus. "Stand back, boy," Ethan ordered. Gage took 2 steps back, his intelligent eyes locked on the wall. Ethan positioned himself on the raised concrete. He hefted the sledgehammer, the weight feeling good in his cold hands. He took a breath and swung. The impact was not the sharp, brittle crack he expected from concrete. It was a deep, hollow, resonant thump that vibrated up his arms. He swung again, harder. A large section of the sloppy plaster exploded inward, revealing not cinder blocks, but something dark. He swung a third time, and the head of the hammer broke through. A puff of dry, stale air, shockingly different from the sewer-like stench of the basement, escaped from the hole. Gage lunged forward, sniffing frantically at the opening before Ethan pulled him back. "Wait!" Ethan set the sledgehammer down and used the claw end to pry at the hole. The plaster fell away, revealing what was beneath it. It was wood. It was a wall of thick, dark wooden planks, expertly joined. They were covered in a thick, black tar-like sealant, a heavy-duty moisture, proofing like one would use on the hull of a boat. It was solid, professional. This was not a patch. It was a barrier. It was a false wall, intentionally built. Adrenaline surged through him, wiping out the cold. He worked with methodical speed, using the claw and the hammer to punch and pry, tearing the planks free from the hidden frame they'd been nailed to. The wood was old, but the sealant had protected it. It splintered and groaned under the force. After 10 minutes of brutal work, he had created an opening large enough to crouch and look through. He retrieved his flashlight, took a breath, and aimed the beam into the blackness. He was stunned. His mind simply could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he was standing in. He was standing in a flooded, freezing, filthy tomb. He was looking into a small, perfectly dry, and perfectly clean room. It was small, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet. The walls were paneled in a warm, light-colored wood. A small braided rug lay on the floor. He could see a wooden chair, a small table, and something else covered in a white cloth. And the smell. As the air vented into the basement, it was not the smell of rot. It was the scent of preservation. It was the faint, clean, sharp scent of cedar and the dry, papery smell of old, undisturbed fabric. Gage pushed his head past Ethan's leg, whining softly, no longer with anxiety, but with a deep, profound, and heartbreaking curiosity. Ethan Riley, a man who thought he had seen the limits of human strangeness, just stared, his flashlight beam unwavering, trying to understand what kind of person would build this, and why they would hide it so desperately. Ethan stood in the freezing, knee-deep water of the flooded basement, the stench of sewage rising around him. In front of him was a ragged man-sized hole, and beyond it, an impossibly clean-smelling darkness. He pushed the flashlight through the opening, setting it on the floor inside so the beam pointed up, illuminating the small paneled room in a ghostly, indirect light. He put his hands on the jagged, broken edge of the floor and hauled himself up, his body heavy with wet clothes and exhaustion. He landed with a clumsy, soaking thud on a small braided rug. He was in. He immediately felt like a desecrator. Filthy, muddy water streamed from his jeans and boots, puddling on the clean, dry floor. He quickly shimmied out of the opening and stood up, his body shivering from the sudden change in temperature and atmosphere. The air in the secret room was still cool and dry. The powerful, clean scent of cedarwood was overwhelming, a preservation smell that had completely sealed out the decades of damp and decay from the basement just inches away. Gage whined from the hole. "It's okay, boy," Ethan said, his voice hushed. The big German shepherd gathered himself and leaped easily through the opening, landing silently on the rug. He shook his body once, a spray of filthy water flying from his coat. "No. Down, Gage, no," Ethan whispered urgently. Gage, ever obedient, immediately dropped to a low crouch, sensing his master's strange intensity. He looked around the room, his nose working, his initial anxiety gone, replaced by a deep, quiet curiosity. Ethan's flashlight beam, pointing up from the floor, cast huge shadows as he moved. He slowly turned, taking in the scene. The contents of the room were correct, but seeing it was different. This was not a storage space. This was a shrine. Against the far wall stood a simple wooden bassinet. It was covered in a light film of dust, but the white cloth draped over it was still bright, not yellowed with age. Next to it, angled slightly as if its occupant had just stepped away, was a small wooden rocking chair. It was, as he had suspected, a nursery in waiting, a room prepared for a life that had never arrived. His eyes were drawn to the third object, the one that was the source of the clean smell. It was a large, beautifully made cedar chest, its rich reddish-brown wood gleaming in the dim light. It was not dusty. It seemed to have been cared for, its surface polished. Ethan felt a profound sense of trespassing. This was a place of deep private meaning. He, a stranger, caked in mud and soaked in floodwater, had no right to be here. He had come looking for a burst pipe and had instead stumbled into the sealed-off heart of the crazy woman the town whispered about. He looked at Gage. The dog had settled by the hole, a silent guardian, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan. The dog's presence gave him courage. He was not here to rob or to judge. He was here because he had to be. He crossed the small room in 2 steps and knelt before the cedar chest. He ran his hand over the lid. It was smooth. He lifted the heavy lid. It opened with a soft, clean whoosh of air. The scent of cedar exploded from within, pure and overwhelming, the smell of preserved memory. He looked inside. The top layer was fabric. Ethan reached in, his rough, calloused fingers, still stiff with cold, touching something incredibly soft. He lifted it into the weak light. It was a tiny hand-knitted baby outfit. It was a pale, gentle yellow. It was perfect. Not a single stitch dropped. It was small enough to fit a doll, and it had clearly never been worn. His breath caught. He had no children of his own. He and Amy had tried, but it had never happened. He had never held something this small, this full of promise. He carefully folded it and set it on the floor beside him. Underneath it was a small object. He picked it up. It was a wooden toy airplane. It was simple, carved from a single block of wood, its wings sanded smooth, its propeller fixed. It was not a store-bought toy. It was, like the knitted outfit, handmade, personal. He set the plane next to the outfit. He looked back into the chest. There was only one other thing on the top layer. It was a small white envelope. He picked it up. It was unsealed. He tilted it, and into his palm fell a tiny, delicate lock of hair. It was a soft, pale brown, tied with a single faded blue ribbon. Ethan's hand, a hand that had held a rifle, fixed an engine, and cut through a padlock, began to shake. This was not a nursery in waiting. This was a memorial. The lock of hair, the ribbon, this was real. This was a child that had been here and was gone. He gently placed the lock of hair back in its envelope. His heart, which he had thought long since hardened against the world, felt a dull, familiar ache. He looked into the chest again. The bottom was not empty. There was a hard metal box tucked in the corner. It was a simple, dark green box, maybe for cash or documents, with a small handle. He lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected. It was unlocked. He opened the lid. Inside, stacked neatly, were 2 bundles of letters, each tied with a faded ribbon, the same blue as the one on the lock of hair. The addresses on the top envelopes were written in a looping, elegant, feminine hand. Next to the letters was a thick, leather-bound book, a diary. Its brown leather cover was worn smooth at the edges, as if it had been opened and closed and wept over many times. And on top of the diary was a single black and white photograph. Ethan picked it up. His thumb smudged the dusty edge as he angled it toward the light. He was looking at the woman the hardware store owner had called crazy. But this was not a crazy woman. This was a girl, perhaps 20 years old, captured in a moment of pure, unguarded joy. Her hair was long, and she was laughing, her head tilted back. She was beautiful. Her arm was linked with that of a young man. He was tall, even sitting down. He was wearing the crisp formal service uniform of the United States Air Force. He was handsome, with a confident smile, and his arm was wrapped protectively around her waist. On his chest, sharp and clear even in the old photo, were a set of pilot's wings. Ethan, the veteran, stared at the face of the young airman, the brother in arms he had never known. He looked at the laughing girl, Eleanor. He looked at the toy airplane. He looked at the tiny lock of hair. And suddenly, the fragmented pieces of a 50-year-old tragedy snapped into place. He was no longer cold. He was no longer aware of the storm outside or the flooded basement behind him. He was a witness. He carefully placed the photo back in the box. He picked up the leather-bound diary. He looked at the small rocking chair. He moved slowly, his wet clothes seeming to profane the space. He sat down in the chair. It let out a soft wooden creak under his weight, the first sound it had made in perhaps half a century. He sat there in the dark, in the hidden room, the flashlight beam on the floor, the smell of cedar around him. He opened the diary to the first page. Ethan sat in the small wooden rocking chair, the rhythmic creak on the floorboards the only sound in the hidden room. Outside the jagged hole he had smashed, the flooded basement was a black, silent pool. Above, the storm still battered the old house, the wind whistling through the eaves, the rain lashing against the siding. But in this small, cedar-scented space, the world was reduced to the leather-bound book in his hands. He was freezing, his clothes were soaked, and a pool of filthy water had formed at his feet. But he didn't feel the cold. Gage, sensing the profound shift in his master, had moved from the entrance. The big dog now lay pressed against Ethan's legs, a solid, warm anchor of gray and white fur, instinctively sharing his body heat as he had been trained to do. Ethan opened the diary. The flashlight, which he'd propped on the cedar chest, cast a perfect circle of light on the first page. The handwriting was beautiful, a young woman's elegant looping script, written in faded blue ink. June 14th, 1968. My father says the world is falling apart. I think it is just beginning. Ethan turned the page. He was a stranger reading a stranger's soul, and he felt the profound weight of the intrusion. But Gage's steady breathing and the silent invitation of the room, a story that had waited 50 years to be heard, urged him on. He began to read, and Eleanor Vance, the crazy recluse the hardware store owner had described, vanished. In her place was a 19-year-old girl, vibrant, intelligent, hopeful, and profoundly trapped. The diary painted a picture of the Vance family, the wealthy conservative clan that had, as the store owner said, practically founded Seacliff Harbor. Her father was a formidable, unnamed patriarch who believed in order, reputation, and bloodlines. July 3rd, 1968. Father spoke today of our duty to the town. He means the town's duty to us. He has already decided who I will marry, a man from a family in Portland. I have not even met him. Father says it is a good match for the business. I feel like a piece of property. Ethan read through a few months of restless, dutiful entries, church socials, charity teas, a life of polite, beige obligation. Then, in August, the tone of the diary changed. The neat script became faster, more energized, as if the pen itself could not keep up. August 22nd, 1968. I met him. I truly met him. His name is Michael. He is a first lieutenant with the Air Force from the base up north. We met at the USO dance in Astoria. I was not supposed to be there. I told Father I was at the library. I do not care. He is everything. He doesn't see a Vance. He just sees me. Ethan the veteran felt a familiar pang. He knew the type. He looked at the photograph still resting in the metal box, the handsome, smiling pilot. The entries became a secret, joyful flood. Eleanor wrote of borrowed cars, of driving up the coast to meet Michael in secret. They walked on the beach below this very cliff. He was from Ohio, the son of a mechanic. He was smart, kind, and he was going to fly. October 10th, 1968. Father found out. I do not know how. He called Michael a penniless opportunist in a uniform. He said his kind died in pointless wars and that I was forbidden from ever seeing him. He told me my duty was to the Vance name. I have never hated that name more than I do today. The entries grew more desperate, but also more defiant. The lovers continued to meet, but now with the weight of discovery hanging over them. November 5th, 1968. Michael says the world is bigger than Seacliff Harbor. He says we can go anywhere. He makes me believe it. He is not afraid of my father. He is not afraid of anything. Ethan turned a page. The elegant script, once so confident, was shaky, as if written with a trembling hand in the dead of night. January 4th, 1969. I am late. I have been late for 2 weeks. I am terrified, and I am perhaps a little bit joyful. It is a secret, a tiny burning star, all our own. I cannot tell anyone except you, dear diary. Ethan paused. He looked at the tiny hand-knitted yellow outfit he had placed on the floor. He looked at the lock of hair, the burning star. He felt a tightness in his own chest, a familiar echo of grief. The next entries were frantic, then resolved. Eleanor had told Michael he did not run. January 12th, 1969. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. I thought my heart would stop. Then he took my hands and he smiled. He knelt in the sand on the beach. He said, Well, then we have to make a proper home for him. He kissed my stomach. He is the best man in the world. This entry was followed by a change in subject. January 20th, 1969. Michael came to the house while Father was in Portland. He looked at the basement. He said it was just wasted space. He is good with his hands like his father. He says he can build a space, a safe place just for us, just for a little while, where we can be a family. He says he will build it from the inside so no one will ever know. Ethan looked around the paneled walls, the well-joined wood. This was Michael's work. This was not just a room. It was an act of defiant love, built by a young pilot, a mechanic's son, hiding in the lion's den. February 15th, 1969. We finished the wall. Michael found a way to seal it, with a waterproof coating he uses on his boat. He even added the cedar planks. He says they keep the damp and moths away. It is our secret, our ark. I have started knitting. He is carving a toy. Ethan looked at the small wooden airplane, but the ark was not meant to be permanent. Ethan read the last piece of the plan. March the 2nd, 1969. The orders came. He has to go. He is being deployed. Vietnam. Ethan's hand tightened on the book. I am so frightened, I cannot breathe. But he holds me and says it is our only way. He will be gone 1 year, 1 tour. He says when he comes back, he will land at the base and he will not stop. He will drive straight here and we will take the baby and we will be gone. We will elope. We will go to Ohio or California, anywhere but here. I just have to be strong. I just have to wait. He read the final entry in the sequence, March 16th, 1969. He left today. I watched his car drive away until it was just a dot on the highway. My heart is in that car. The room is finished. The chest is full. Now, all we have to do is wait. Be safe, my love. Just be safe. Ethan slowly closed the diary. He sat in the darkness, the rocking chair still. The storm was still howling, but it seemed distant, unimportant. He was no longer in his own house. He was in Eleanor's. He looked at the hole he had smashed in the wall Michael had built. Gage pushed his head under Ethan's hand, sensing the deep, profound sorrow that filled the small room. Ethan sank his fingers into the dog's thick, rough fur, grounding himself. He had found the story. He knew with a dreadful, aching certainty that the story did not have a happy ending. Ethan sat in the small rocking chair, the leather-bound diary heavy in his lap. The cold from his soaked jeans had seeped into his bones, and he was shivering, but he made no move to leave. He was no longer just an intruder. He was a guardian. He had to know the rest. Gage, sensing the deep, somber shift in his master, pressed his heavy body more firmly against Ethan's leg, a silent, warm offering of comfort. The only light came from the flashlight on the floor, its beam pointing at the cedar-paneled ceiling, illuminating the small, hidden room in a pale, weak glow. He had closed the diary on Eleanor's last hopeful entry. Be safe, my love. Just be safe. Now he picked up the first bundle of letters from the metal box. They were thin, almost translucent airmail envelopes, the kind marked with red and blue stripes. He recognized them instantly. V-mail. He untied the blue ribbon. The letters were from Michael, postmarked from Bien Hoa Air Base, Republic of Vietnam, dated through the spring and summer of 1969. Ethan read. He read Michael's vibrant descriptions of the heat, the noise, and the rain. He read of Michael's frustration with the war and his unwavering, desperate hope for the future. He called Eleanor his Northern Star and referred to the baby as our little co-pilot. July 14th, 1969. I can almost picture it, Eleanor, me walking up that gravel path, you standing on the porch holding him. That's the image that gets me through. Just hold on. I'll be home before the winter storms. I promise. Ethan swallowed, the cold in his throat tightening. He read the last letter in the stack. It was dated August 30th, 1969. It was short, written in a hurried hand. It's loud tonight. I miss the sound of the ocean. I miss you. I think about the room we built, our safe place. I love you both more than I can write. I'll see you soon. I'm coming home. That was the last one. Ethan carefully retied the ribbon. He set the bundle of hope aside and picked up the second, much thinner bundle. These were not airmail. They were official envelopes, cold and impersonal. He didn't have to read them all. He only had to read the first one, the one on top. It was not a letter. It was a telegram dated October 4th, 1969. The Secretary of the Air Force regrets to inform you that First Lieutenant Michael J. Anderson was reported missing in action. Ethan stopped reading. He didn't need to see the rest. He knew the sterile, practiced language of loss. He had seen these letters before, folded and given to weeping wives. Missing in action, the two cruelest words in the military vocabulary. Not the finality of death, but the unending agony of its possibility. He now understood. He picked up the diary again, his movements slow and heavy. He flipped past the hopeful spring and summer entries he had already read. He found the entry for October 1969. The beautiful looping script was gone. It was replaced by a frantic, jagged scroll, the ink blotched and smeared as if the tears had fallen on the page as she wrote. October 5th, 1969. It came today, the man from the post office. He wouldn't look at me. He just handed it to me. Regrets to inform, missing. No, he is not missing. He is just late. He promised he would come home. He promised. Ethan read through weeks of entries that were just the same two words written over and over. He promised. He promised. Then came the entry that explained her solitude. November 17th, 1969. I told my father. He knew I was pregnant. He looked at me not with anger, with nothing. He said I had made my choice. He said the Vance name had been disgraced by a nameless pilot and a child of shame. He told me not to come to the main house again. I am not disowned. I am erased. Ethan felt a cold fury settle in his stomach. He thought of the hardware store owner, crazy, hiding a fortune. No, she was abandoned. He turned the page. The diary was blank for many weeks. The next entry was dated. The ink was different, a darker black. December 18th, 1969. The pain started, a full month early. Ethan's blood ran cold. He looked around the small, windowless room. The storm outside his house was still raging, the wind shrieking. He was reading about another storm in this exact spot 50 years ago. It's a storm, a terrible one. The wind it sounds like it wants to tear the house from the cliff. The power is gone, the phone is dead. I tried to call the doctor. I tried to call my father's house. No one answered. I am so cold. I came down to the room, Michael's room. It's the only safe place. It's the only place he would know to find me. The next entries were fragmented, written in a scroll that was barely legible. They were a chronicle of terror, pain, and profound isolation. The pains are so strong. I am so alone. Please, Michael. Please, I can't do this. I keep screaming. No one can hear me over the wind. The rain is freezing on the windows above. It's happening. It's happening now. There was a gap of several hours. Ethan held his breath. He turned the page. He is here. Just those 3 words. Ethan let out the breath he didn't know he was holding. He is here. He is so small, so perfect. He has Michael's eyes. I have named him Thomas Michael Anderson. He is so beautiful, but he is so quiet. He is not crying. Ethan looked at the small, dust-covered bassinet in the corner. He looked at the yellow knitted outfit he had set on the floor. He is cold. The room is so cold. I have wrapped him in everything. I am holding him against my skin. He is not moving. Please, please, Thomas, cry. Make a sound. He is so weak. I'm holding him in the rocking chair. I am singing the song my mother used to sing, the one about the sailboat. He is just looking at me. His little chest is hardly moving. Ethan found himself rocking, a slow, unconscious movement in the chair. He was sitting in the chair Eleanor had held her dying son in. He read the final, agonizing words on the page. He's gone. My son is gone. He was here for 3 hours. He just stopped breathing. He's so cold. Michael is gone. My baby is gone. I am gone. Ethan closed the diary. He couldn't read anymore. He sat in the darkness, the flashlight beam a harsh, indifferent spotlight. He, a man defined by his own loss, was now drowning in someone else's. Gage let out a long, low whine and pushed his head forcefully into Ethan's lap, breaking the spell. Ethan scrubbed a hand over his face. He was not crying. He was just empty. He had to finish. He opened the book one last time, skipping ahead past weeks of blank, empty pages. He found the last entry. It was dated February 1970. The handwriting was neat again, but it was not the elegant, hopeful script of the girl. It was the tight, controlled, precise script of a person who had hollowed themselves out. I bought the plaster and mortar in Astoria, where no one knows me. I paid cash. I have finished the wall. It is done. Michael built this room to keep us safe. I have finished his work. I have sealed it. The world cannot have them. The town cannot whisper about them. My father cannot erase them. This is not a grave. It is a room. It is their room. I will be the keeper. I will live in this house until I die. I will be the guardian of the door. No one will ever get in. No one will ever know. Ethan closed the book. He understood. He understood the crazy woman. He understood the weak foundation. He understood the 50 years of solitude. He looked at the jagged, violent hole he had smashed into the wall. He had broken her promise. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a world scoured clean and dripping. The wind was gone, replaced by an exhausted gray calm. Ethan had not slept. After the diary, he had sat in the cold, cedar-scented room for what felt like hours, Gage's head resting on his knee. He was no longer shivering. A different kind of cold had settled deep in his bones, a cold fury at the silent, cruel injustice he had unearthed. With methodical care, he had placed the tiny yellow outfit, the wooden airplane, and the lock of hair back in the cedar chest. He put the photograph, the letters, and the diary back in the metal box and nested it beside them. He closed the lid, the soft whoosh of the seal sounding like a final, heavy sigh. He and Gage had emerged from the hole back into the flooded, filthy reality of the basement. He had waded through the knee-deep, stagnant water, his flashlight beam illuminating the destruction. The house, his sanctuary, now felt violated by two separate tragedies. He had spent the early morning hours in a grim, practical silence. He found the main breaker and, checking for submerged wires, shut off all power to the house. He opened the bulkhead doors on the outside of the house, which he hadn't known existed, and the storm surge water in the basement began to slowly, sluggishly drain, leaving a thick black layer of mud on everything. He worked automatically, his body moving through the motions of disaster cleanup. But his mind was not on the flood. His mind was with the young pilot. He was a veteran. He belonged to a tribe that crossed generations. He understood the casual, brutal finality of a telegram. He understood the hollow, sterile phrase missing in action. It was a bureaucratic word for a wound that could never close. Michael J. Anderson. He felt a duty to the name. He remembered the hardware store owner's voice. Folks around here always had theories. Plain crazy. He thought of the Vance family, the patriarchs who had founded this town. He realized the town itself, the one he had sought for its quiet, was the other character in this story. It was the silent, unknowing witness. By mid-morning, he had done what he could for the basement. He changed out of his filth-caked, soaked clothes and into his last clean pair of jeans, a thick wool sweater, and his brown leather jacket. "Come on, Gage," he said. The dog, who had been watching his every move, was instantly on his feet. They drove the truck into Seacliff Harbor. The town was emerging from the storm, shopkeepers sweeping water from their stoops. Ethan drove past the hardware store, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He parked in front of the smallest brick building on the main street, the Seacliff Harbor Public Library and Historical Archive. He left Gage in the truck, the window cracked, and walked inside. A small bell chimed. The library was one room, smelling of floor wax, old paper, and sea damp. A woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun looked up from a desk. She wore half-moon glasses and a cardigan. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. She was Mrs. Holloway, the town librarian. "I hope so," Ethan said, his voice gravelly. He was aware of the mud on his boots, of his unkempt beard. "I'm looking for old newspapers, your archives." She assessed him over her glasses. "Are you a resident?" "I am. I just bought the Vance place up on the bluff." A flicker of something, the same recognition he'd seen in the hardware store, passed over her face. "I see. The archives are on microfiche. What year are you researching?" "I'm a veteran," Ethan said, finding it easier to use that as his cover. "I'm researching the service record of another airman who I believe was from this area, Michael J. Anderson. I'm looking for 1969 and 1970. Mrs. Holloway nodded, the mention of military service apparently satisfying her. "Anderson. I don't recall that name, but the Vance, that's an old line. The archive reader is in the back. She set him up at a large beige machine, a relic from the 1970s, and showed him how to load the spools of film. He was left alone in the corner, the only sound the low mechanical hum of the machine and the quiet click, click, click of the dial as he scrolled through the past. He started with October 1969. He scrolled past grainy photos of the local high school football team and ads for canned soup, and then he found it. October 5th, 1969, the same day as the diary entry. It was a small 2-inch column buried deep in the national news section. Local connections to war. It listed the names of 3 men from the county, including First Lieutenant Michael J. Anderson, MIA. That was all. A name in a list. He felt a flash of anger. This man, this vibrant, hopeful young pilot, reduced to 3 words in parentheses. He remembered the diary. Missing in action. Eleanor had received a telegram, but she, like Ethan, would have searched the papers, desperate for any information. He kept scrolling, moving into 1970. He was looking for a retraction, a correction, a follow-up. He was looking for a miracle he knew had not come. He advanced the reel to February 1970, and he found it. It was another small article, but this one had a grainy uniformed photo. It was Michael. The headline read, "Local Pilot Awarded Medal for Bravery." Ethan leaned closer, his heart hammering. He read the text. It was not a happy story. It confirmed that Michael J's status had been changed from missing in action to killed in action. He had been officially declared dead. His plane had been lost during a rescue operation, trying to extract a downed reconnaissance team under heavy fire. The medal was posthumous. Michael had not just disappeared, he had died a hero trying to save others. Ethan, the soldier, felt a profound, aching connection. He closed his eyes, offering a silent soldier-to-soldier acknowledgement of the sacrifice. "I see you," he thought. He sat back, exhausted by the discovery. He had his answer. He had found the end of Michael's story, but his research was not done. He now knew the when. He knew Eleanor had lost her lover and her child in the same brutal winter. He thought of the hardware store owner again, a strange one, crazy. He remembered the Vance family, the founders. How had they reacted? He switched reels, going back to the months just after Michael was reported missing. He didn't know what he was looking for. He scrolled idly through the pages of late 1969, his mind numb. He turned his attention to the society pages, the announcements of births, marriages, and town events. It was a morbid curiosity. And then he saw it. It stopped his breath. It was a large, formal announcement, taking up half a page. It was dated December 28, 1969. Vance Sinclair engagement announced. The photo was of Eleanor, but it was not the laughing, joyful girl from Michael's photograph. This was a different person. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes were empty, dark pools of shadow. She was wearing a pearl necklace. She looked like a ghost. Beside her, not touching her, was a man in a severe suit, a wealthy-looking man in his 40s. The text identified him as Mr. Bartholomew Sinclair III of a prominent Portland family. Ethan stared at the date. December 28, 1969. His mind flashed back to the diary. December 18, 1969. The pains started. He felt physically sick. While Eleanor was alone in that house, a month away from losing her child, grieving her lost love, her family was announcing her engagement to a stranger. They were not just erasing Michael. They were erasing her. They were papering over the disgrace with a high society marriage. Ethan realized the full, breathtaking scope of the cruelty. He finally understood Eleanor's choice. The crazy woman on the cliff. She wasn't just grieving, she was fleeing. She had chosen 50 years of absolute crushing solitude over being forced into this lie, over letting her family bury her tragedy. The sealed room was not a tomb, it was a fortress. The padlocked door was not just to keep others out. It was to keep Michael and Thomas safe in. He sat there, the light of the archive reader illuminating his rugged, weathered face. A face now set in a mask of grim understanding. He was, he realized, the only person on earth who knew the truth. Ethan did not go back to the house immediately. He left the small library, the chime of the doorbell sounding hollow in the quiet street, and walked. Gage, sensing his master's need for movement, kept pace at his heel, a silent gray and white shadow. He walked past the hardware store, its owner now visible through the window, oblivious to the history he had dismissed as crazy. He walked past the tavern, past the fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. He walked until he reached the high, wind-swept promontory at the edge of town, the same one where Eleanor must have stood, watching for a car that would never return. He understood everything. The 50 years of solitude were not madness. They were a vigil. The rumors of a hidden fortune were a bitter, ironic joke. The only treasure in that house was a cedar chest full of heartbreaking, priceless memories. The hardware store owner, the gossiping town, even his own realtor, they were the weak foundation Eleanor had feared. Her isolation was not an illness. It was an act of profound, lifelong defiance. It was her only defense. She had built a wall around her life, just as she had built one in her basement, all to keep the memory of Michael and Thomas pure, to keep them safe from the judgment, the whispers, and the cruel, pragmatic dismissals of the outside world. She had been a soldier, Ethan realized. She had guarded her post for half a century, alone. And in his clumsy, desperate search for a burst pipe, he had breached her defenses. He stood on the cliff for a long time, the cold wind pulling at his leather jacket. He was no longer a trespasser. He was, by accident, the inheritor of her duty. "We have work to do, Gage," he said, his voice low. The dog looked up, his intelligent eyes reading the new purpose in his master's face. They returned to the house. The next few days were a blur of hard physical labor, a penance for his intrusion. The basement was a disaster, a cold, muddy soup of sewage and ruined boxes. He rented a heavy-duty sump pump from the hardware store, accepting the owner's curious look with a neutral expression. He pumped the black water out, letting it drain onto the rocky slope far from the house. When the water was gone, it left behind a thick, slick coating of gray mud. He shoveled it out bucket by bucket, his muscles screaming in protest. Gage sat at the top of the stairs, a stoic supervisor, whining softly whenever Ethan slipped in the muck. When the mud was gone, he attacked the source. He drove back to town and bought new copper pipes, solder, a torch, and fittings. He spent an entire day in the cold, damp air, teaching himself plumbing, cutting out the rotten, burst section of the old iron pipe, and carefully soldering the new, clean copper into its place. The sound of the torch's hiss was loud in the empty space. When he was done, he turned the main valve. There was a sound of rushing water, a thunk as the pipes pressurized, and then silence. No leaks. He spent 2 more days scrubbing. He bought bags of lime to neutralize the smell. He scrubbed the concrete walls, washing away 50 years of damp and the recent violation of the flood. He ran 2 borrowed roaring dehumidifiers for 48 hours straight, until the air in the main basement was no longer putrid but dry and clean. He did all of this with a singular focus, to protect the room Michael had built. He was securing the fortress. When the main basement was finally clean, dry, and safe, he turned his attention to the hole he had made. It was a jagged, violent wound in the wall. He could have bought plaster and mortar, as Eleanor had done. He could have sealed it back up, restoring the secret, locking it away forever. But as he looked at the dark opening, he knew he couldn't. To seal it again would be to bury it. Eleanor's duty was to seal it from the world. His duty was to protect it from decay. He was a keeper, not a jailer. He made one last trip to the hardware store. He did not buy plaster. He bought fine-grained oak, recessed cabinet hinges, and a small magnetic push latch. He, like Michael, was good with his hands. He spent a full day building. He squared the opening, framing it properly. He built a door, a heavy, solid panel of oak, and he painstakingly fitted it into the opening. He recessed it so that it sat perfectly flush with the wall. When he was finished, it did not look like a door. It looked like a section of wall, a patch, unremarkable and solid. Only someone who knew exactly where to press would feel the magnetic latch give way. It was a clever, hidden door. That evening, the work was finished. The basement was clean. The secret was secure. Ethan stood in the main basement, wiping his hands on a rag. Gage stood beside him, no longer anxious, no longer fixated on the wall. The dog seemed to be at peace. Ethan pressed the hidden spot. The door opened with a soft whisper of air. He ducked inside. He left the door open, letting the clean air from the basement circulate. He retrieved the flashlight and switched it on. The room was just as he had left it, sacred, still. With reverence, he knelt by the cedar chest. He picked up the leather-bound diary, the metal box of letters, the single photograph of the laughing pilot, and the beautiful, hopeful girl. He placed them one by one back inside. He gently ran his fingers over the small wooden airplane, its wings smooth. He touched the soft, yellow-knitted outfit, a repository of a mother's dreams. He closed the lid. The sound was soft, a near-silent whoosh as the cedar sealed itself. He did not leave. His eyes fell on the small wooden rocking chair, Eleanor's chair, the chair she had sat in, holding her son Thomas as his small life slipped away. Slowly, Ethan Riley, a tall man weathered by his own different war, sat down in the small chair. It gave a soft wooden creak under his weight, the first sound it had made in 50 years, a sound of acceptance. Gage, his duty done, walked into the small room. He did not sniff at the bassinet. He did not bother the chest. He walked to the open doorway, lay down, and placed his noble gray and white head on his paws, his body positioned as a sentinel, facing out. He was guarding his master. Ethan sat in the profound, cedar-scented quiet. He looked at the back of his loyal dog. He had come to Seacliff Harbor seeking silence, an empty void to escape the gunfire and the memories of his wife, Amy. He had been running from his own past, terrified of the noise in his own head. But the house had not given him an empty void. It had given him someone else's story. It had given him a purpose. Sitting in that small hidden room, in the chair of a woman who had shown a different kind of courage, Ethan finally felt the knot of his own grief, the one he had carried for years, begin to unclench. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was the keeper of Eleanor's. He reached out his hand, resting on Gage's strong back. He was not alone. And in the silent, protected memory of Michael, Eleanor, and Thomas, Ethan Riley finally, truly found his peace.